Welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Church, a church of open minds and loving hearts since 1866, celebrating many sources of wisdom and many spiritual paths. Your faith, your doubts, your questions, your identity are welcome here. I'm Gus Braga, serving as worship associate. Reverend Luke is at home this morning after testing positive for COVID. He reports his symptoms are quite mild and hopes to be back again next week. Knowing he had illness in his home this past week, he pre-recorded his sermon before this morning, which we will view together, and thanks for your flexibility and understanding. Find upcoming events in your order of service and join us after service for coffee and donuts in the Commons. We have special events the next 2 weeks. Next week is our annual flower communion at both services. Bring a flower from the roadside or a garden to add to our communal bouquet. And don't worry, we'll have extra if you don't have one with, as we mark the threshold of summer with this ritual of community and beauty. The following week, June 12th, we move to one service at 10 a.m. for the summer. That's June 12th, scheduled through Labor Day. Following the service, join us for an annual meeting with updates from your leadership about the life of our church. Church members are invited also to vote on the slate of new leaders. You should receive an e-news to vote electronically and contact the office with any questions. Now, let us enter this time of worship with these words from our minister in the 1870s, Reverend Eliza Tupper Wilkes. May our faith in humanity and our message of hope and good cheer light our way.
We come together this morning to remind one another to rest for a moment on the forming edge of our lives, to resist the headlong tumble into the next moment until we claim for ourselves awareness and gratitude, taking the time to look into one another's faces and see their communion, the reflection of our own eyes. This house of laughter and silence, memory and hope is hallowed by our presence together.
That's always one of my favorite hymns for a variety of reasons, but I do like that it talks about being together and kind of taking that time to process things. And if anyone has been like me, processing this last week has just been kind of a difficult chore. And I have found that by taking out and wandering and just being outside without any real destination in mind has been something that's been very therapeutic for me. And what I think is important is to have something to focus on that isn't necessarily what you have been focusing on. So I like to look for rocks. And so today's book kind of talks a little bit about all the different things that rocks can represent. And it can represent a lot of different things to a lot of different people, so I'm going to let you fill in all of the metaphors and similes that might come to mind. If you find a rock, written by Peggy Christian, photos by Barbara Hirschlember. If you find a rock, a nice, flat, rounded rock that sits just right in the crook of your finger, then you have a skipping rock. You toss it out onto the water, just so, and see it trip across the surface, making a chain of spreading rings. Or maybe you find a soft white rock, a rock that feels dusty in your fingers. Then you have a chalk rock, and you use it to make pictures on the pavement. Or you might find a big mossy rock by the side of a long, steep trail. Then you have found a resting rock. And as you sit down, you feel the cool moss squish below you. Then again, you might find a rock with a stripe running all the way around it, and you trace it with your finger and circle all the way. You're very lucky because you found a wishing rock, and you whisper what you want before you throw it. And if you find a rock, like a really big rock by the edge of the water, then you've found a splashing rock. When it hits the surface, the water jumps out of the way, raining back down onto your outstretched hands. And the bigger the rock, the wetter you get. Or maybe you find a pile of small round pebbles, smoothed by the water. Then you have found sifting rocks. You can scoop up a handful and let them slowly slide through your fingers. Or maybe you find a rock whose water-smooth surface catches your eye. It feels easy in your hand, and when you rub it, then you've found a worry rock. You rub it between your fingers and your troubles are smoothed away. Then again, you might find a rock sitting in a grassy field. When you push it over, you have found a hiding rock. And in the cool, dark underside live all kinds of things that creep and crawl and hide out of sight. But if you found a rock, a great rock that towers over you, then you have found a climbing rock. And holding on with your toes and fingers, you grip as hard as you can. You stretch and pull until you reach to the top, where you feel much grander than you did on the ground. Maybe you will find a twisting line of rocks sticking up out of a creek. Then you have found crossing rocks, which wait to meet your feet as you pass over the water rushing all around you. Or maybe you might find a rock with a print of something else, a leaf or a shell. Then you have found a fossil rock, and you feel the shape of something that lived long, long ago when the rock was very young. Then again, you could find a small rounded rock right in front of your toe as you're going down the sidewalk. You have found a walking rock, and you kick it ahead of you and let it lead you home. But if you find a rock that's not a skipping rock or a chalk rock or a resting rock or a wishing rock, that's not a splashing or sifting or worry rock, that's not even a hiding rock or a climbing rock or a crossing rock, fossil rock or walking rock, but you like it anyway, because it reminds you of a place or a feeling of someone important. Then you have found a memory rock, and sometimes those are the best rocks of all. Joe and Austin will now play the children's benediction.
This is my father, Bruno, born in the early 1920s, raised in Shanghai, China, and who is Portuguese by blood. I hear he was wild, talented, funny, fought a lot with his brothers, and was often up to mischief with them. He attended St. John Bosco School in the British colony of Shanghai, China. In the 1950s, he was fortunate to flee China with my mother, grandmother, and uncle due to the communist invasion only because of the secretive intervention of his father, who was the Shanghai Vice Consul of the Portuguese consulate in Shanghai, China. My father and the crew, of course, had very little they could bring with them when they fled. Starting over and finding work back then was very difficult. Dad worked very hard to find work that paid the bills for the 8 of us. He found odd jobs for a number of years and eventually became the traffic manager of the airline CAT, stands for Civil Air Transport, in Kobe, Japan, which eventually was bought by and became the hub of the CIA. Because of Dad's ability to speak many languages fluently, he was secretly hired by the CIA and eventually worked with the all-volunteer U.S. pilot group nicknamed the Flying Tigers, commanded by General Claire Chennault. Dad said he lived through 7 wars. During that time, our family experienced tremendous physical and mental violence from my father during his visits home. We struggled much with our emotional and spiritual well-being. My mother, who had no skills or employment because of her Chinese position as an Oriental woman, bravely created her own work to supplement our growing expenses as a family. Mom and us never knew of his clandestine work till much later in Dad's life. My father had incredible social skills, and so did we all. On the surface, all through school, our family was looked upon by others as very outgoing and respectable people. Only one family friend knew the explosive, violent behavior Dad released on us during his short visits home from his CIA ventures and years after he left the agency. Living with him in those times for 8 years was living on eggshells, petrified of what would release his fierce belligerence. Some things I learned in working through this family history of abuse, which includes my own lived violence as an individual, a father, and husband, was that there is a bigger picture of who my father, me, and siblings are. The fun talent shared, playing the guitar, the ukulele, singing, the curiosity and adventurous mindset that opened the door for all of us to try new and sometimes daring things. Skydiving, catching moray eels and snakes, fishing for sharks, to ask for mercy as well as give forgiveness for wrongdoings. We have chosen and learned to be more patient, kind, loving, generous, and thoughtful, influenced by this difficult family narrative. The Mennonite tradition, similar to some of our church's principles, espouses that authentic living in the world is intrinsic to an ecclesiology that understands people, where the health of each member determines the health of the others. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all of us celebrate it. We do not live in a vacuum, as everything we are and do is because of humankind working and affecting everything around us together. As author Talitha Aho says in her book, In Deep Waters, may we care enough to jump in, trust enough to float, and imagine a better future we can all swim toward together. My father was much more than I could ever have imagined, and I am grateful for his memory and life.
Good morning. It is good to be with you. I invite you to settle in here as we create a place of communal caring and connection. It's our time to pause amidst the busyness of our lives, to slow down enough to consider the beauty that is here all around us, and to open a space for listening and love. Here we honor all who support us in this caring, loving, and all-inclusive ministry. We send gratitude to Colleen Murphy, serving as our caring coordinator, arranging care for our members and friends in need. The members of our caring committee are wonderful examples of our compassionate community, holding us up as we go through challenging and happy times. And these last 2 years have taken a lot out of us. They have taken a lot from us. If during this time of increasing needs in your life, you are experiencing challenges, we encourage you to reach out for support and help. Many of us may need additional care, whether it be personal pastoral care or other assistance, and we encourage you to reach out to Reverend Luke or myself with that request. In this community, we share pieces of our lives with one another. We do this because all people here have value. Each person's experience matters. We lift up those who are experiencing sadness, illness, or loneliness. May the strength and love in our congregation help guide you. We revel in those who are experiencing joys in their lives. May their happiness lift us all, and may their joy filter into all around them. May all of us find love, hope, joy, and healing strength in this community. Please hold Tony Charlebois and family in your hearts. Tony's father, Lawrence Charlebois of St. Paul, passed away on May 21st, and we send strength and support as they deal with this loss. So I ask you to breathe deep the breath of life. Feel below you the earth and its ancient turning, and above you the sky and the stars, shining with ancient light, holding you in this space, yourself made of earth and stars. Sit deeply here in this community of love and justice, hope and grace. Know that here you are named and you are known as beloved. I invite you into this time of meditation, this time of prayer, first by sharing silence together. Spirit of life, source of love, God of many names and beyond all naming, we hold in our hearts all those who suffer in mind, body, or spirit. I invite you to bring the names you are holding in your heart this day, in joy or sorrow, celebration or concern, and silently or aloud now in this time to speak their names. For all those names spoken and unspoken, may we be held in love and grace. These words of prayer come from Reverend Luke. For the sacred souls lost and the hearts shattered beyond repair, for the ways we perpetuate violence with gun access, with toxic masculinity, with refusing to adequately fund and provide resources for mental health, for all of us in systems of violence. May we remember we each have some way, however small, to respond. Our votes, our prayers, our broken hearts strengthening our resolve until we all do the work of laying down anything that supports swords and shields, and we study war no more. May the faith and the spirit of life, love for the community of earth, and love for the light in each other be ours now and in all the days to come. And for our offertory, May's Justice Partner is P-Fund. As the regional GLBTQIA plus grant marker in the Upper Midwest, P-Fund supports activists, organizers, practitioners, artists, educators, and communities. They support many communities in the work of eradicating homophobia and transphobia for lasting change. We'll now receive today's offering.
The first reading is Measuring Up by Ruth Calder Murphy. Don't measure me with scales and tapes. I'm not a pumpkin prize that should be reckoned so. Don't measure me by height or weight, discard or accept me, judge me or pity me, love me or despise me, based on the bodily size of me. I'd ask you to measure the pleasure my words bring, or the perspective of my paintings, or the depth of my thought. But I ought not for the dark of night, when words flee and sights irrelevant, and my brain is incapable of anything more than staying afloat, of staying alive. And I'm not talking of physical night that falls softly at the dawn, slips away, but the darkness that thunders round my soul in plain sight of day. What then? Will I be found wanting when all sense and sanity have gone away? Put them away. Your plumb lines and your calipers, your gauges and thermometers, scales and tintometers. Close your eyes, if you must. What they see is only dust, though dust true and beautiful. Now, in the silence and the dark, feel the beating of your heart and spirit running through. These things alone are true, and they should be the only measurement of you or me. The second reading is How to Love the Living by Julia Kasdorf. I learned from my mother how to love the living, to have plenty of vases on hand in case you have to rush to the hospital with peonies cut from the lawn, black ants still stuck to the buds. I learned to attend viewings even if I didn't know the deceased, to press the hands of the living, to look in their eyes and offer sympathy, as though I understood loss even then. I learned that whatever we say means nothing. What anyone will remember is that we came. I learned to believe I had the power to ease awful pains materially like an angel. Like a doctor, I learned to create from another's suffering my own usefulness. And once you know how to do this, you can never refuse.
Glad to be joining you today, even if not as I wished. I wish I'd be over there in the pulpit with you this morning. But a reminder of the risk in our community still as the pandemic lingers on. I'm grateful that I'm feeling well, even if I can't be with you. Look forward to being with you again next week. And grateful to be with you in this way. I learned from my mother how to love the living, writes the poet Julia Kasdorf, these words that I need to hear again and again this week. She writes to have plenty of vases on hand in case you have to rush to the hospital with peonies cut from the lawn, to press the hands of the living, to look in their eyes and offer sympathy. I learned that whatever we say means nothing, she says. What anyone will remember is that we came. What will anyone remember? What anyone will remember is that you come, you show up. What are we coming with, showing up for in response to an endless litany of tragedy? For some, this week has been a horrific reminder, though we have regular reminders of gun violence all the time on different levels, different scales, sometimes ignored or forgotten for many reasons of oppression and injustice. But a reminder for some this week from Sandy Hook and how many others of how little has changed. How much work has been left undone for the work that really matters because of political divide, because of partisan bickering, because of moral failures of leadership. Whether it be a lack of courage or a conflict of interest with their largest donors like the NRA, or the perpetuating narratives that somehow the right to bear arms, which was somehow so unregulated now, is more important than someone else's right to life, to liberty. It is draining to the mind and the heart and the soul to keep preaching to the choir about these things, these echo chambers. I struggle to imagine what could begin to break up these narratives, these entrenched practices, beliefs of a definition of masculinity that so often leads to violence. These protections and idolatries of weapons and guns in American culture. How do we move from where we are to where we should or could be? I'm not sure. There are some obvious things that can make an impact, some difference. Political leadership, public opinion, giving voice to every elected leader on your roster, in your district, in your area, about what you value and why. About the importance of background checks, even as this wouldn't have prevented this shooting. Or the importance of banning assault rifles, which would have prevented the easy access to these weapons. Study after study shows the uniqueness of this problem in the United States. The New York Times reported the number of mass shootings between 1998 and 2019 in the United States was 101 mass shootings. The next closest of modern democracies was France with 8. 101 and 8. Now, as much as some would like to quickly isolate this as simply a troubled individual, which he certainly was, or an isolated incident, which they are in many parts of the world, but it doesn't seem like it here, it is an ethical necessity to keep asking the echoing, haunting question, why? Why does this happen at all? Why has so little changed? Why can't we figure it out? Why? Must this be the world we live in? We know we cannot separate such horrific acts from the larger context within which we live, like anything. Where while these instances certainly pose major concerns and are heartbreaking heart-shattering moment in the public realm. It's also part of a larger problem with gun access and the majority of gun deaths that happen under the public eye, beneath the surface every day. Suicide, homicide, which points to cultural and social norms. It also points to the sheer amount of accessible guns in our country. Study after study, again, shows the more guns around, the more gun deaths there are. Kind of obvious. The guns obtained by this troubled soul were obtained legally. And it just grates the soul that is factual, that can exist. That assault rifles are available for purchase by the average person the moment they turn 18. The Second Amendment that I was taught about was about a well-regulated militia to fight against oppression, in theory. It was not this obsession with mechanical weaponry and the right to be able to protect oneself every single day, to feel like you are entitled to carry a firearm anywhere. And then come all the reactionary solutions. To arm teachers, good God. To arm citizens outside of schools, which this school had a school resource officer. To put in traps or locking systems of doors, all of these militarized responses. Can you imagine what the school would feel like then? As well as trauma responses. Ask any teacher or any student how the active shooter drills after Columbine, after Sandy Hook, and so many others has ever made them feel more safe rather than either confused for the youngest ones or simply just afraid. Heaven help us. The heart can barely stand it, comprehend it, make space and time to even think about it or try to. You know all of this. We know all of this. And sometimes what makes it so hard, what makes you shudder at drop-off in front of the elementary school where your entire family spends their day with the flag at half-staff out front. It clouds the mind and heart. As you try to make it through the news without feeling sick, as you try to make it through some coherent thoughts before becoming overwhelmed, to try to keep going through the day to find some good news or some just normal pandemic news, whatever, to not ignore the tragedy, but also to not scare the children or to scare ourselves. Like anything, these moments of reminders of the larger problems, the larger challenges of a gun culture and toxic social norms and isolation, these moments point you back to the necessity of scaling things down to what your soul, your mind, your heart can reasonably manage. Take a breath. Often these spirals of rage and overwhelm reorient me again, not to ignoring, but to the wisdom of the ancients, of the Jewish Talmud, which I keep trying to inscribe in my heart by memory. So I'll say it aloud for you here a few times through. The Talmud says in its commentary on the prophet Micah, the 6th chapter, it says, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." I'll read it again. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And once more, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. As our hymn today says, thoughts and prayers which rightfully get a bad rap in such times for being empty, hollow, meaningless, which they often are. If they are to be of any good, they must be backed up with what prayer was always meant to mean, that has been lost over and over again. Prayer, meditation as a way to help the soul hold the enormity of heartbreak, to help focus one's energy and intent on compassion, which leads to action and resolve. If prayer or meditation doesn't lead to an impact on how you're living your life, how you act in the world, then I'd say you're doing it wrong. Whether you pray or meditate or scream or write or draw or hold on to your child or make the most beautiful music you can, we each need some way, some conduit, some catalyst to hold the intensity of grief and rage and heartbreak and filter it through some expression to move out on the other side of overwhelm, because you can't stay there, with something meaningful, to move out to the other side with something purposeful, impactful, filled with agency and action and empowerment and policy and hope and justice and love. And it can take 1,000 forms, remember that, large and small. As the hymn says, anything that comes out of prayer or meditation or spiritual practice, it has to have a love that dares, that lives, that breathes, that acts. Or as the poet says, how to love the living. To show up for the grief-stricken, to simply be present to those, to bear witness to pain. Showing up with flowers or a hot dish, and then here's the important thing, turning from that moment, broken open by compassion. As the flower leaves your hand in sympathy for another, then your hand must pick up something, the ballot, the phone, the pen, or you find in your voice or your action or your will the ability to make your mark, whatever it is, to help unravel this tangled thicket. Sometimes, for me, it helps me to remember that while it is so large, so big, so overwhelming, the toxic messages of masculinity and violence, the absurd protection and idolatry of weapons, and the ways we weaponize expectations of how we are supposed to be, to act, like the other poem about how we're measured up by this society because of gender, class, race, and more, and how those expectations constrict people with little or no support for their mental, social, and soulful health. Because it is so large and there is so much work to disentangle it, then it helps me to remember that each little act by each person in each moment is needed. We need all of it because of its enormity. Maybe you call your senator. Maybe you disrupt the relative or friend who says, boys will be boys, and you ask, what do you mean by that? Or maybe boys should be good humans. Maybe you show up to whatever you do and the people around you, and you offer your care, your heart, your assurance that you'll do whatever you can to keep moving the scale toward peace and justice by grieving the dead, supporting survivors, and working like hell for the living. We need it all. Rage, policy, art, protest, conversation, disruption, collaboration, rituals, vigils, candles, bullhorns, marches, and anger, kindness, compassion, love. Flowers and hot dish, and hands held in the visitation line, on the protest line, in the bus line, on the way back to school. Reminding each other this world is not free of suffering. And yet we make our way, and we do what needs to be done. Like Elia Hunja, who writes, and the world doesn't stop. She writes about this back and forth between the news of shootings and death, in between changing diapers and sending emails and wiping the counter, the ways life doesn't let up, and we are forced to keep finding ways to move forward. That maybe is the hardest thing. finding ways to keep moving that don't feel entirely useless or wrong. This back and forth between doing something that feels meaningful and refusing to let the grief of it all take away the beauty of the world or joy. To keep holding each other in love and in care as we respond to the world each day and we try to navigate where we can find our agency in our community, in our county, in our state, in our country. How do we respond? By doing justly now, loving mercy now, being humble now. Not needing to complete the task. It's never done, the work of restoration and justice and love, but refusing to abandon it. Because the beauty of this world and the love therein is worth our heart breaking open sometimes. Maybe that's some of the only good news, is that if your heart keeps breaking at the news, there is still love there. And to hear how many hearts are breaking, there is still love out there. Maybe it's worth that broken, open heart sometimes for the tilling and the tending of the soil to see what more love and compassion and hope and justice can grow, like soil breaking open to some new life, to find its way out of the dark, out of the dust. We can't repair everything as much as we'd like to. The soul's lost, the heart's broken in a way that will never fully heal. And because there is so much to do, it is ours to mourn the dead and to work like hell to love the living. To learn to believe, writes the poet, that you have power to ease awful pains like an angel, to find in suffering your usefulness. Or as the old hymn beckons us to remember that we'll sing in just a moment, may the cries of war fall silent when we all serve one another, love one another, believe that the right to life and liberty is more important than the right to weaponry. Then piece by piece, the broken heart might start to be mended, and our heaven here might, in glimpses, find its way to begin. May it be so. Amen.
The closing is by Eric Williams. Blessed is the path on which you travel. Blessed is the body that carries you upon it. Blessed is your heart that has heard the call. Blessed is your mind that discerns the way. Blessed is the gift that you will become on the journey. May you go forth in peace. Amen.